We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we have a book author in studio who's written a book which is not entirely about immigration, but is partly about immigration. And I thought it would be good to have him come in and talk about some of these issues. The author is Simon Hankinson, who is a scholar at the Heritage Foundation, a retired Foreign Service officer. And the book is The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey. So as you can tell, it's not just an immigration book, and there are parts of it that, that sort of aren't in our bailiwick. But two of the chapters are specifically about immigration, one on borders and then one on kind of who's legally here, who shouldn't be, what kind of benefits they get. And so I thought it would really be worth having Simon come in. Especially I wanted to talk about your first chapter, Simon. Thanks for coming in. Your first chapter is the first commandment, you shall have no borders. In other words, basically the conceit here is this is the requirement of wokeism, kind of. Although in this case, it's also a requirement of libertarianism. Why'd you make that the first chapter? Because you've got chapters on like trans issues and the media and stuff. We don't have anything to do with that stuff, but those are pretty hot issues in themselves. Why is the no borders chapter the first one? Why do you lead off with that?
Well, thanks, Mark, and I appreciate you having me today. I think it's the most fundamental commandment because just as the family is the foundation of society, the nation state is the building block of a civilized world. It's the Marxist left that wanted the Internationale, where we would rip down all borders and it would be like a giant workers' commune of Soviets and everybody would live happily ever after.
Or the John Lennon song, Imagine, which is the same thing, basically, except the music.
Great tune, but just pity about the lyrics.
Yeah.
If you live in the real world and you actually know more than two people, you understand that nation states have been critical to preserving prosperity and safety for at least some people in the world amidst the chaos that has been human history. And that commandment, you will have no borders, is frankly making pretty good inroads into left-wing parties across the Western world, including the Democratic Party, where people just will outright say, to give you one example, Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of BLM, says outright, or at least has in an essay for Harvard, we believe in abolishing immigration enforcement. We believe basically that means open borders, right? If you don't have any enforcement,
sure,
anybody can come, anybody can stay. So to me, it's the fundamental thing, the gender ideology, critical race theory in schools, the destruction of our institutions, our media, that's all super important on the social war front. But if we don't have a country to defend in the first place, then none of the rest of it matters.
And so why is it so important to the left? You see what I mean? In other words, is it really a prerequisite for all the other stuff they want to do? Because the libertarians, for instance, they don't want any borders either, and some of them might be for some of that other leftist stuff because they're, as I constantly say now, they're objectively part of the left coalition now. But there's other things that, libertarians would not agree with that you're writing about here as wokeism, and accurately so, in my opinion, you're writing about them. But why is open borders so important to the left and the libertarians? I just don't get it.
Well, the one thing that I agree with libertarians on whenever we have a discussion is that you cannot have open borders and a welfare state at the same time. So they're like, we just need to get rid of the welfare state for illegal immigrants. But anyone who's been in Washington for 5 minutes knows that's not going to happen.
Right.
You're not going to be able to pass laws that will strip all illegal immigrants of health care education, et cetera. So
and
that's
even if you did, you wouldn't be able to enforce them.
Exactly.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to enforce it. So it's a non-starter. So we're back to square one, which is you can't have open borders.
Right.
For the left, I want to give the Democratic Party and many of its voters some credit here. I don't believe that this is a mainstream. I don't believe everybody who's electing Democrats believes in open borders and not enforcing the law. Right now, they definitely seem to believe that immigration law should not be enforced.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say there's a wing of the party, the far left, the blue hair, nose ring, campus radical protest crowd that really does believe in what they call abolition. They want to abolish the carceral state, meaning the criminal justice system, and they want to abolish borders for purely ideological reasons.
Right.
And then I think there's a cynical group of politicians who have done the math, and you've written about this, and Heritage Scholars and many others, that the more illegal immigrants you get into a state, the more seats you get in Congress. And if your state is already voting for Democrats,
in the census,
then California, New York, Illinois, et cetera, you're getting more people in the census.
And it creates more of a clientele for large government as well. In other words, you have a kind of dependent class to some degree.
No, absolutely. And I think that for the left, if you look at Western Europe, has been their block, their voting block is people who are 100%. I think in Britain, I was just there for 2 weeks, is where I was born. I read that slightly over 50% of the population now is a net taker from the fisc.
Right.
Which is a scary situation. You want everyone to have a dog in the fight. We want to help people out when they need it.
Sure.
But if more than half of people are paying less into the system than they're taking out, you're into some serious structural problems.
Yeah, it's kind of like Herb Stein, who was the actor Ben Stein's father, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Nixon. I think he's the one who said, if something can't continue forever, it won't. And this is an example of that. But you bring up a point about most Democratic voters probably don't go for this no borders thing. But there's actually Democratic politicians who at least don't. I mean, Bernie Sanders, most notably, before he ran for president, was questioned about this by Ezra Klein. And he said, open borders is a Koch brothers, in other words, libertarian idea. He abandoned that for political reasons when he was running for president. But I think recently he restated the same idea as you can't have open borders. So even on the pretty far left of the spectrum, who would actually not agree with some of the other chapters in your book, there are people, pretty prominent people on the left, at least old left, who do believe in borders. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that there's this evolution, I guess, on the left. I mean, it is sort of a generational thing, if you think about it, that, the older kind of labor-oriented economic left still makes the case, at least theoretically, for borders, whereas the younger kind of cultural, almost anti-American left doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of that older, wiser branch of the Democratic Party as, the raging cage.
Well, they weren't that wise, but I mean, they were less unwise, in my opinion.
Wise policy-wise,
Yeah, okay.
Meaning they want to win elections, right? Because ultimately,
I see what you mean.
Yeah. I mean, what people believe is one thing, but they all want to get elected so that they can carry out some of what they believe.
Right.
And when you listen to James Carville talk about this issue, I don't know what he personally believes about borders, but he saw that this was not going to be a vote winner, that open borders was just not popular with enough Americans to get you over the line outside of, Pramila Jayapal's district in California and a few others.
Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly. It was not nationally that popular. So I think there's a lot of cynicism in this, a lot of manipulation. Bernie Sanders is, pretty consistent on this, but the Democratic Party's changed so much from being the party of the blue-collar, non-college educated Americans to now the party of, college-educated Americans who can't get the job they think they deserve, plus a much higher percentage of women than men, and so on and so on. So the blue-collar males, I think Steve Camerata from CIS is the guy that gave me the numbers on this. 25% of American men with only a high school education are out of the workforce from ages 20 to 65. Those guys have been abandoned by both parties, you could argue.
Right.
And if they had to pick one now, they probably would be more likely to pick the Trump flag and the Vance flag as someone who might protect their interests in this globalized world.
I appreciated in the 2 chapters on immigration, all the chapters, you have a section at the end, and not just a section, but who to follow, who writes about this, kind of almost like a handbook if you want to learn more. And I appreciated that in each of the immigration chapters, CIS got some kind of shout out to Steve Camarada in one of them and to Todd Bensman's book. He's now working for Tom Homan, but he wrote the book on the Biden border crisis while he was here. So I appreciate that. So this is also kind of a theoretical question, I guess, about non-borders, open borders. Can you even really have democracy if you don't have borders? Or even related to your other chapter, which was about the distinction, do we have a distinction between being an American or not? Can you really have a democracy? Is it sustainable if anybody in the world can come here and anybody can vote? In other words, what does we the people in the preamble of the Constitution even mean if there's kind of no such thing as we the people?
I would argue no. The Jeffersonian concept was that we would be, a sort of shareholding democracy of landowners who had some stake in the game. And, originally you had to be a property owner, I think, to vote in most states and be over a certain age. The idea not being to strip people of the vote, but to give it to those who had a stake in it and who could act responsibly. I was just in Britain, like I said, and I'm kind of looking at their long-term trajectory if they keep up the level of mass migration they have now and if their own fertility stays as low as it is. The same with France, with Italy, with Germany, where they're seeing now in one generation 25% and up of their population from other cultures.
Right.
And the futures I see are, Lebanon or maybe the United Arab Emirates, Dubai.
Or Yugoslavia even.
Well, Yugoslavia, I guess, would be an even worse case.
Right,
where you've got, large percentages of people fighting all the time.
Right.
But in Dubai, say, most of the people there don't participate in the democracy. It's run by a family.
Yeah, right.
But all the work is done by people from South Asia, people from Europe, people from Africa, and somehow it holds together. There are people who want to go there on vacation.
A friend of mine actually just came back from Dubai. He was like, wow, this is great. It's just the shopping malls everywhere and customer service is great. Yeah, well, sure
it's like Singapore, it works, but it's a particular model that you might not be able to export to every country.
Yeah.
And then you have Lebanon, where a fairly stable and very prosperous society. The Lebanese are some of the smartest people I've ever met and excellent business people. But at a certain point, the demographics swamped that compromise that they had. And now it's like armed camps where everybody picks up their own trash and generates their own power. And there doesn't seem to be much of a central government operating. Now, I'm not saying that's happening in the U.S. Anytime soon, but you do see a rise of these ethno-constituencies, these enclaves, like, say, areas of Minneapolis where people vote on ethnic, on racial, on national origin lines. And now New York City, which, to my real shock, honestly, is about, I think, to elect someone who is a committed socialist. He's only 32 years old, very, very thin on experience. And this is a city that is bigger than a lot of countries in the world and has a bigger economy than an awful lot of countries, including places like Denmark and Hungary, probably a bigger population. So I think that the politics change radically based on the demography, and we may not have understood that quite as much as we should have.
Right. And actually, you bring up Lebanon and elsewhere, it sort of leads me to question I should have asked maybe at the beginning. How did you get to do this book? How did you get to be Simon Hankinson Heritage Foundation, first of all? And then what led to this book? Because you served overseas in a number of countries, right?
Yes. Yeah, I was a foreign service. So I came here from the UK. I wasn't born here. I lived in France for about 5 years before that. And I joined the Foreign Service in 1999, went to India, Fiji, Ghana, Slovakia. So I did 3 Africa tours, 2 Asia, 2 Europe. I had a great time. I really enjoyed serving my country and living in all those places, learned a lot. But by 2020, with the election of President Biden and his inserting woke ideology into just about every aspect of American life at the federal level, it really affected our diplomacy. It affected the State Department, the organization of the State Department. And, I started taking notes and listening to podcasts. I was locked down on COVID, I think probably 6 times, where they'd give you a call and say, oh, you were at a meeting and somebody at that meeting met someone.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah.
So were you in D.C. during COVID? Or
No.
were you?
I was consul general in Marseille to begin with.
Well, the French Riviera is a nice place to be during COVID, right?
It was a gilded cage for sure. I'd done 2.5 years of my job. So the last 6 months, I wasn't able to go and shake hands and drink champagne. I could live with that.
Could you go to the beach, or was it like California where you weren't even allowed to go to the beach?
You were not, when I was in Marseille, there were a couple periods where things started to open up a little bit and then they would shut them right down. But the worst of it, you had to have print out an attestation, like a personal oath of one whole page and sign it and carry it around with you that would allow you to walk your dog or go to the store for 1 hour a day. So I would go out on the street and maybe once or twice I exceeded that hour because I like to walk. And it would just be a ghost town.
Wow.
I hope we never live through that again.
Yeah, right, for sure. Well, let me ask a question about your service. Most foreign service officers, either their first tour or close to it, do visa processing. Did you do visas at any point, and did that help inform your perspective on all this?
I sure did. Yeah, my first tour was New Delhi, and I did probably 100 and something visa interviews a day.
Wow.
My highest one-day total, that they had an emergency in Pakistan because they had to fire the entire local staff due to fraud. And so they put out the bat signal. I went and volunteered for a week, and I did 230 interviews in one day.
Wow.
I will not say that they were the most the most polished interviews of my career, especially since I spoke Hindi and everybody spoke Urdu.
Which are close enough.
Yeah, they're pretty close, close. So yeah, no, that informed a lot. I'd already had some experience. I'd read about immigration and studied it a bit in college, but seeing it practically, what an H-1B or a B visa looks like, what a qualified applicant looks like versus an unqualified applicant, was a real eye-opener. And I learned so much about migration patterns. We had a lot of people coming from the Punjab, for example, and there was an American community, and you sort of saw where they were going. They were going to parts of California, parts of New Jersey,
right.
Where supposedly they're just going to go look around and be tourists, but they had no money, and it so happened that their uncle owned a gas station, and you could put two and two together.
Right.
So fascinating tour. I loved the country, and I learned a lot. And then I did visas again in Ghana.
Oh, really?
And Fiji and Slovakia. Where
was that on purpose, or were you punished, or how does that work?
A little bit of both. If you bid it, you might get it. Is the slogan. So you have to. No, I had a good time in Ghana. It was another really interesting tour. I liked a lot about it. But the fraud there was very high, just like in India.
Mm-hmm.
You've got some excellent visa applicants. You got some students who are fully qualified and business people and tourists and whatever. But you have an awful lot of economic migrants who will do and say anything to try to get around a consular officer. So it was hard work, but very interesting.
Interesting. So in the chapter 8, which is the commandment, this is the other immigration-related commandment, you shall have no nation. One of the things you talk about there is birthright citizenship, and this is obviously a hot issue. The places that you served, I'm thinking, I don't remember all of them now. I don't think any of them have birthright citizenship, or if they did, it's pretty tight. So, is it sustainable really in the modern world for the United States to maintain the way we've been doing things, which is basically birth certificate is your proof of American citizenship?
Yeah, I would argue no. I think because the 14th Amendment has been interpreted to give everybody born here citizenship, but there's some pretty good research and a strong argument to be made that should not be the case without getting too far into the weeds. And the president issued an executive order saying that the State Department should not issue passports to people who simply on the basis that they were born here, that there's got to be a bit more to it than that. We'll see where that ends up in the courts. But no, I think this might be something Congress should act on, because you have people flying in from China, say, or Nigeria or Russia, rich people who want to give their kids American citizenship. And they come here, they have a full package where they get put up in a hotel, and then they give birth, and then they go home with a nice passport, Social Security card.
And don't grow up here.
They don't grow up here. They have absolutely no ties to the United States, no interest in the United States. They would not serve if we were calling them up to serve it, to fight in a war.
Despite the fact that your kids and mine would have to go and rescue them for if something happened, some revolution in the place they're actually living in.
Absolutely. No, I'll never forget the Lebanon evacuation. I think it was the first one, maybe 20 years ago. And, we paid millions of dollars to evacuate people who, of their own volition, went back to the country that they were born from and fled. And look, you're entitled to do that. I have no problem with that. But to then expect Uncle Sam to bail you out seems a little bit chutzpah.
Yep, as they would say in Lebanon.
Maybe not there, but a little further north.
South,
sorry.
The one of the other things that's been in the news a lot, and I got a question recently on this at an address I gave at Northwestern University, is this issue of foreign students or even just any non-immigrants whose opinions are kind of fundamentally anti-American. And should we tolerate that sort of thing? And that's kind of in this issue of who's an American, who's not, who's a citizen, who's not. That's kind of an important issue because, if you're a green card holder, you're more rooted here than just a foreign student, for instance. So how do we think about that? How do we draw the line between, say, a green card holder who's not a citizen yet, who's, saying, yay, Hamas, you didn't rape enough children, compared to like a foreign student or a tourist or something like that?
Yeah, there is a sliding scale of obligations, of duties, and of benefits. And it starts with American citizens at the top, and it goes all the way down to you're here on a tourist visa to go to Disneyland. You still have certain protections, of course, to due process, but you have the right to free speech, but that doesn't insulate you from the consequences of your attitudes or your speech. And in the INA, there's a section that says that the president can basically keep out anybody he believes is detrimental to U.S. national security. And the Supreme Court has ruled that that is his discretion, and the courts can't look into the details of why he decided that way. And then the Secretary of State, under a different provision, has the right to keep people out if he believes that their presence would be detrimental to U.S. foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would strongly argue that students like Mahmoud Khalil or Mahmoud Tal, who are coming here on the premise that they're going to be students, presumably so they can then get a job and pay some taxes and be supportive, productive members of society. If they come here and not only criticize our foreign policy, capitalism, America, our history, our traditions, but also call for the destruction of one of our closest allies, then they've crossed that line. And yeah, should they have that right to that free speech? But they came here to study. They did not come here to be full-time protesters. And I don't have an issue out of the 1.2 million students we have here,
mm-hmm.
making an example of a few of them to say, you broke your promise when you said you were coming here to get a degree, and you're basically a full-time politician, and your views are anti-American. We're going to have to ask you to go somewhere else to study.
Right. The way I think about it is, and the question I received was specifically, shouldn't the First Amendment cover these people? It's like, yes, it does, in the sense that we don't put you in jail or execute you or rip out your fingernails for saying death to America, but you're a guest, and we can say, okay, time's up. We have no obligation to let you stay here, especially if you're just a tourist or a foreign student. Now, in your experience, this was, you were doing visas before I think we really fully jumped into this, but how do we keep out people with those kind of views from getting into the country in the first place? It's a lot harder once you have Mahmoud Khalil here with his, free lawyers and publicity and all that stuff to try to get him out. How can we do a better job of not letting in people who are likely to end up like that in the first place?
That's the $1 million question. When I started doing visas in India, we had a little piece of paper, DS-156, I think it was called, that they would fill out by hand, and then
mm-hmm.
we would fill in a couple sections. We had a database that we could check, but it was very primitive. After 9/11, we got wise because we had let in, I think, 19 hijackers on visas.
Right.
Now, at the time when they were issued, they were perfectly issuable. They were young men. They had no criminal records that we knew of, from a country where people tended to go home again. They had money and they were going for what looked like a legitimate purpose. But of course, if you had investigated each one, you would have found that they had...
Although some of them, to be honest, National Review actually got a bunch of the visa applications before the State Department. They destroyed some of them before they could get to them. And they had things like destination, Marriott Hotel in New York. There's like 14 Marriott hotels, or, destination, whatever it was, Oklahoma or something. It was ludicrously incomplete. And frankly, a more meticulous visa process would probably have rejected most of them, even though, as you say, there are other aspects that would have seemed normal.
Well, I will tell you from personal experience that was completely normal at the time. Yeah. The message that you were getting from Washington or from your front office, your ambassador, was, what's the holdup?
Right.
Why aren't you issuing more visas? One, they wanted more issued than denied. And two, get them through the building, move them through the house. So I actually I had lunch with a guy in Saudi who had issued about 7 of those visas in Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, they were under a lot of pressure to issue. Had they spent I mean, like I said, if I did 230 interviews in one day, you can imagine how many minutes I spent on each one.
Right.
If you really did a deep dive one day interview and background investigation on every visa case, we would deny a lot more of them.
Right.
Which is why I think the advent of enhanced vetting, artificial intelligence, social media screening is really a good thing. The latest case that caught my attention was this guy in Louisiana who was a Palestinian born in Gaza, had moved to Egypt, I think, in 2024, right after the October 7th attack, in which he participated in gruesome ways. And he'd hidden all that from the adjudicating officer when he applied for what we think was an immigrant visa that his wife had sponsored him for. I'm not sure what the category was, but I'm pretty sure it was an immigrant visa. And clearly he lied on everything. But what if you look at the officer doing the adjudication, what information did he have to go on? If you want to check the background of someone in Gaza, are you going to call up Hamas and say, hey, can I have a criminal record check on this guy? Well, for one thing, unless it was buried in a tunnel, it's probably flattened by now or burned. And two, they wouldn't have shared it with us. And if they had, it would have been a lie. And that's true of many, many countries where either through incompetence or malice or inefficiency, there just are no records to check, which was why the whole catch and release at the border and parole program, one of many reasons it was an utter disaster was that we let in tens of thousands of bad guys that we're now discovering have drunk driving records, criminal records, murder, rap sheets a mile long that we just had no way to check. Right.
Now, some of the other topics you dealt with is welfare for immigrants, the integrity of voting. In other words, who's a citizen, who's not, who gets to vote and who doesn't. I want to ask a kind of more general question, which again, probably I should have asked at the beginning, but why this book in general? I mean, the immigration parts or the non-immigration parts, what led you to write it?
Frustration, rage. I mean, when you're in the government, understandably and fairly, you cannot publish. You cannot write without clearing it through a lot of people. So I got told once, if you want to write about coin collecting, enjoy. If you want to write about foreign policy, it's going to be an uphill struggle. And I accepted that. So I would, write little notes to myself and put things in drawers. And then I came over to Heritage, and just one day it struck me that, all of these nuggets that I had really formed a pattern. And the pattern was the left, the so-called progressives, they were not telling you, these are ideas to think about. Let's talk about this. Let's expand rights for this or that group of people. Let's re-examine our history. Let's add to our history. They were commanding you to believe certain things. If you did not accept that a man who says he is a woman as much as your mom or your sister, you are a bigot, and they will attempt to cancel you, to not hire you, to make your life as difficult as possible. And so I saw them in terms of commandments, that we'd gone from debating and discussing issues and then kind of going for a beer afterwards to living in an environment where you either believed it or you didn't believe it. It was very much like a religion.
Right. You'd be stoned for blasphemy, basically, or at least digitally stoned.
A lot of people have been digitally stoned on social media. I mean, J.K. Rowling, just to take one on the gender issue, but on critical race theory, if you came out and said, Roland Fryer, I write about him as a professor at Harvard. He was the youngest tenured economic professor at Harvard. He happens to be black, for what it matters. But he published some research, very carefully investigated, and I think he followed up with a second study to make sure he was right. But he published research proving that despite what people were saying after the George Floyd riots and Ferguson ones before that, the police did not disproportionately kill young black men. And he's an economist. He's publishing this as fact to be like, now we can debate about it, and maybe it's important, maybe it's not, but it's just a fact. And they tried to hound him out of Harvard with a sex discrimination complaint, I think it was. And then later he committed another sin because he did some research on education and found out that, lo and behold, if you have good teachers who spend a lot of time in class, if kids do their homework and they have supportive parents, and you have good discipline and all of these really obvious things, I shouldn't say really obvious, but they seem pretty obvious to me, then any kid can succeed. It's not about race. It's not about national origin. It's about these other factors. And again, that went against the woke commandment that any disparity between groups of human beings has to be racism, sexism, transphobia. It cannot possibly be that some people act differently than others and therefore have different results.
So to get back to immigration, what is Heritage? What is the department there on immigration that you're in? This is a relatively new thing. I mean, not super new, but past few years that Heritage has really gotten into the immigration issue kind of in a more detailed way. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, we've had people, experts writing on immigration for years.
Sure.
Hans von Spakovsky and Carly Stimson, Mike Howell, and so on.
Robert Rector on welfare and immigration.
Robert Rector, right. Who touch tangentially. They may be centering on something else, but they also talk about immigration. But we started a Center for Border Security and Immigration in 2022 to deal specifically with this issue. And I imagine the impetus was the disastrous open border and this unprecedented abuse, I would argue, of presidential prerogative with parole and on and on and on. And so they needed to bring in some more firepower. And I joined as a senior research fellow. I retired on a Friday and I joined on a Monday.
Wow. Okay.
And got right to work. And then now we've had a series of visiting fellows, people who were in the government before. Often, now that we're at bat, as it were, at least ideologically, those of us that believe in immigration enforcement, many of our former fellows and allies are actually in the government trying to carry out policies that they believe will make the country safer.
Join the club. So
yeah, exactly.
Although that's an experience Heritage would have had, because obviously Heritage Foundation writes on a whole variety of areas. So when there's Republican administration, there will be people cycling in and out. For us, it's a totally new experience, but it's it feels good. So how big now? I mean, how many people do you have there? Laura Reese, I know, is at the center. How many people do you have there writing on immigration?
We've got 4 full-time staff in the building, and I think about 3 or 4 visiting fellows.
Okay.
In the previous iteration, we had the former heads of USCIS, Customs and Border Protection, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement were all visiting fellows.
Right.
Obviously, very informed about what was going on. And now we have somebody who was formerly at DHS, I think just brought on board CISA, Center for Information Security,
right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And we have someone who's an expert on immigration and from a different angle than me. And so we try to bring in a good stable of people who can cover the whole immigration, border, and homeland security package.
This isn't about the book, but I'll give you a chance to advertise. You have an event coming up in November on the H-1B issue. Most people will listen to this before that happens. So what's the story on that?
That is my next paper is going to be about the H-1B visa, which I have adjudicated many of in my time. And we're going to have a panel that's really going to focus on how this visa that, like so many things in immigration, started off as what looked like a good idea. Now, let's bring in a limited amount of skilled people at a time when we have a national need to help grow our economy. And then over the years, it has become, not entirely, but to a significant degree, a mass cheap labor program that is replacing American workers. And at a time when artificial intelligence, I say it looms like a wrecking ball over the economy, companies are saying out loud, yeah, we're going to stop hiring for a while and see what happens if we can still be profitable. Well, that's fine for people who are living off their retirement savings, but it sucks if you're 22 and you just came out of college.
Right.
And if you were a kid who was told, get a STEM degree, and you did, and now you can't find a job, we really have to consider how this is a game changer and how we can reform this H-1B visa so that it's putting America first, to put it bluntly, and that we are adding people to the economy as necessary rather than just because it's cheaper and easier.
So is there an event that's related to that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
This is what I was giving you a chance to advertise.
You threw me the ball and I let it fall into the sand. November 19th, I think it's at 9:30. We're going to have a panel event on the H-1B visa and talk about where it is today and how we can reform it for the better.
Do you stream these two?
I believe this one will be streamed. Not always. Sometimes they're only live, but we've done a lot of renovation work, so we have a much bigger facility there, and have some experts, some of which you may have heard of, who'll be on our panel.
I'll be on the panel, but and so this is at heritage.org. They can look it up.
Yes.
And the other thing you can look up is Simon's book, Simon Hankinson, Hankinson. The book is called The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey. And don't be afraid if you actually do want to obey a few of the commandments, but the immigration ones there's 2 whole chapters on it, really are, I think, a good kind of overview of where we are on immigration between not just the left and the right, but, the left and the libertarians, although you're not writing about libertarians, and kind of everybody else in some sense. It's not even really a left-right issue. It's a kind of extremes versus most of the people clustered around the center, whether center right or center left. So I'd definitely recommend it. There's a lot of endnotes and references so that if you want to learn more, there's a good opportunity to do that. So Simon, thanks for coming in, and we'll put in a link to the Amazon link for the book. And I'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks at your H-1B panel too.
I'm looking forward. It's going to be very interesting. And thanks again for having me today.
And finally, a note that's kind of important, I think. It sort of marks a closure of the Biden border crisis. We've all seen that the numbers at the border just tanked almost immediately as soon as President Trump was sworn in, and they've remained pretty low. Art Arthur on our staff has written 2 blog posts this week, one kind of summarizing the numbers going down. And that's because the fiscal year ends at the end of September, and they finally got the fiscal year 2025 numbers out. It was delayed, obviously, because of the shutdown, and they're the lowest numbers we've seen like since the 1940s or something. I mean, we'll put a link in the show notes. It really is remarkable. But the other thing, he also wrote a blog post that's, I think, shows how the other aspect of the Biden border crisis has also come to a close, and that is the globalization of illegal immigration. Because President Biden basically put out the invitation to the world's illegal immigrants, and people took him up on it. They were, instead of just coming from, overwhelmingly from Mexico with a smattering of people from Central America, they were coming from everywhere, not just South America and the Caribbean, but Africa, Asia, you name it. I've personally met people at the border from Angola and the Republic of Georgia and elsewhere. So what Art did was look at the numbers, the sort of the more recent numbers, basically the past 8, 9, 10 months. And what we've seen is that illegal immigration is both way, way down, obviously, at least at the border, and it is returned to a more normal pattern of being mostly Mexicans with some Central Americans mixed in, rather than the huge numbers of Chinese and Indians and Africans and Europeans, you name it, that were coming under Biden. And so my point here is that it kind of puts a bow on this issue that the border crisis really is over. It's not that border enforcement is over. It's never going to be solved, because this is just a part of being in the country business. You're always going to have to deal with this. But the crisis created by the irresponsible policies of the prior administration has come to an end, with numbers down and the global reach of illegal immigration also dramatically reduced. Both of those blog posts will have notes, we'll have links in the show notes. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. Thanks to our producer, Brian Griffith, for making this work. Thanks to Simon Hankinson for coming in and talking about his book. Thanks, of course, to all of you for listening. If you have any complaints, comments, ideas for future shows, just email us at center@cis.org. And until next week, this is Mark Krikorian.